March 12, 1938. Austria vanishes from the map. German tanks roll through Vienna. The nightmare begins in stone. The thunder of tank treads echoed through the cobblestone streets of Vienna as German panzer divisions rolled across the Austrian border. It was 6 o'clock in the morning when the first Wehrmacht soldiers crossed into what had been, just hours before, an independent nation. By nightfall on March 12, 1938, Austria had ceased to exist. The Nazis called it the Anschluss, the Union, but the truth was far simpler and more brutal. It was an annexation, swift and bloodless, that would mark the beginning of Adolf Hitler's European conquest. Within hours of the German occupation, the machinery of persecution began to turn with terrifying efficiency. Political enemies, Jews, intellectuals, and anyone deemed a threat to Nazi ideology, found themselves dragged from their homes in the dead of night. The sound of jackboots on apartment stairs became the soundtrack of terror across Vienna, Salzburg, and Innsbruck. SS officers with clipboards moved through the cities, systematically identifying targets from lists prepared months in advance. There would be no trials, no appeals, no mercy. But imprisonment alone was not enough for the Nazi vision. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the SS empire, understood that concentration camps could serve a dual purpose. They would eliminate enemies while simultaneously generating profit for the Reich. The key was finding the right location, somewhere isolated enough to hide the worst atrocities, yet valuable enough to justify the investment in infrastructure and guards. The answer came from an unlikely source, a small Austrian town called Mauthausen, nestled in the rolling hills 40 kilometers southeast of Linz. For centuries, the people of Mauthausen had quarried granite from the massive deposits beneath their feet. The stone had built churches, monuments, and civic buildings across the Austrian Empire. But what the Nazis saw was something far grander, an endless supply of building material for Hitler's architectural fantasies. The Führer's vision for the Thousand-Year Reich demanded monuments that would dwarf the pyramids of Egypt. Massive government buildings, towering victory arches, and ceremonial highways would showcase Nazi power to the world. These projects required millions of tons of granite, and Mauthausen's quarry contained exactly what they needed. More importantly, it offered something the Nazis valued even more than stone: the opportunity to work their enemies to death while building their empire. On a grey morning in August 1938, just 5 months after Austria's annexation, the first transport train arrived at the newly constructed Mauthausen station. The cattle cars disgorged 300 prisoners from Dachau, Germany's first concentration camp. These men, political prisoners, communists, social democrats, and Jehovah's Witnesses, had been selected not for execution, but for a task that would prove even more sinister. They were ordered to build their own prison. Under the watchful eyes of SS guards with machine guns and attack dogs, the prisoners began laying the foundation stones of what would become one of the most feared camps in the Nazi system. They stretched barbed wire between wooden posts, erected watchtowers at strategic intervals, and constructed the first wooden barracks. With each stone they placed, each fence post they drove into the Austrian soil, they were unknowingly sealing their own fate. But Mauthausen was different from other concentration camps, from the very beginning. While camps like Dachau and Buchenwald were classified as Category 1 or 2 facilities, places where prisoners might theoretically be released after serving their sentences, Mauthausen received the most ominous designation possible: Category 3. This classification was reserved for incorrigible political enemies of the Reich, who were never intended to leave. It was, quite literally, a camp of no return. The granite that had drawn the Nazis to this location would become the instrument of torture and death for tens of thousands. The very stone that prisoners quarried during back-breaking 14-hour shifts would be used to build the monuments celebrating their oppressors. Every block of granite extracted from the earth represented hours of agony, gallons of sweat, and ultimately human lives ground to dust in service of Nazi ambitions. As word spread through the SS hierarchy about Mauthausen's potential, Heinrich Himmler himself visited the site in the autumn of 1938. Standing at the edge of the quarry, looking down at the prisoners already beginning to show signs of malnutrition and exhaustion, he smiled. This place would serve the Reich well. The prisoners working below had no idea that they were carving out not just granite blocks, but their own graves in the Austrian hillside. The sound of hammers striking nails echoed across the Austrian countryside as prisoners worked 16 hours a day to construct their own tomb. Under the autumn sun of 1938, the first wooden barracks took shape, each nail driven under the threat of a rifle butt to the skull. SS Oberfuhrer Franz Zierreis, the newly appointed commandant, watched from his headquarters as the skeletal framework of Mauthausen rose from the granite bedrock. He had received explicit orders from Berlin. This camp must be operational before winter. The prisoners worked with their bare hands, hauling wooden beams that weighed more than they did after weeks of starvation rations. The watchtowers went up first 8 concrete and steel structures, positioned at perfect angles to provide machine gun coverage of every corner of the compound. From these towers, SS guards could observe the entire construction process, their fingers resting on triggers, ready to shoot any prisoner who moved too slowly or collapsed from exhaustion. Barbed wire came next, rolled out in concentric circles around the perimeter. Not the simple farm fencing used to contain livestock, but military-grade razor wire designed to shred human flesh. The prisoners who installed it worked without gloves, their hands cut to ribbons by the sharp metal edges. Blood dried on their fingers as they twisted the wire around steel posts, each drop a testament to the deliberate cruelty embedded in every aspect of Mauthausen's design. By December 1938, the main camp was complete, but Zierreis had received new orders from Himmler. Mauthausen was to become the administrative centre of a vast network of subcamps stretching across Austria and into southern Germany. The granite quarry alone could not satisfy the Reich's appetite for slave labour and building materials. The first subcamp opened at Gusen, just 4 kilometres from the main facility, in the spring of 1939. Here, prisoners would operate a second quarry, one even more brutal than Mauthausen itself. Within months, additional camps sprouted across the region, Ebensee for rocket fuel production, Steyr for manufacturing aircraft components, Melk for building underground factories. Each facility was connected by trains that transported prisoners like cattle from one hellish assignment to another. The expansion accelerated as Germany invaded Poland in September 1939. Political prisoners from Warsaw, Krakow, and dozens of smaller Polish cities arrived in cattle cars at Mauthausen station. They joined the growing population of Austrian dissidents, German communists, and Jehovah's Witnesses, already breaking rocks in the quarry. The camp's capacity, originally designed for 800 prisoners, swelled to over 3,000 by the end of 1939. Construction never stopped. New barracks rose from the frozen ground throughout the winter of 1939 to 1940, built by prisoners whose fingers had turned black with frostbite. The SS provided no heating, no warm clothing, no medical care for the workers. Those who collapsed were shot where they fell, their bodies dragged away to make room for the next shift. By 1941, as German armies swept across Europe, Mauthausen had metastasized into a network of 49 sub-camps spanning hundreds of kilometers. At Linz, prisoners manufactured V-2 rocket components in underground tunnels. At Gross-Ramming, they built aircraft engines for the Luftwaffe. At Leubel Pass, they carved a highway tunnel through the Alps using hand tools and explosives. Every morning, thousands of prisoners were loaded onto trains and transported to their assigned work sites. Guards counted heads like inventory, beating anyone who moved during roll call. The stronger prisoners were sent to the quarries, the weaker ones to factories where they could work sitting down. But weakness was temporary. All prisoners eventually found themselves assigned to the stone pits, where death was not a possibility, but a mathematical certainty. Ziares maintained meticulous records of the expansion, filing reports to Berlin that documented the industrial capacity of each subcamp with clinical precision. The camps had become factories that consumed people and produced stone, weapons, and death in carefully measured quantities. The screech of metal wheels against steel rails pierced the morning air as another cattle train pulled into Mauthausen station. It was 7:15 in the morning on a freezing February day in 1942 when the doors slid open with a thunderous crash. Inside the cars, packed so tightly that many had died standing up during the journey from Prague, hundreds of Czech resistance fighters stumbled into the Austrian sunlight. Their legs, cramped from days without movement, could barely support their weight as SS guards, with German shepherds, shouted orders in a language most did not understand. The stench hit them first, a nauseating combination of human waste, rotting flesh, and industrial chemicals that seemed to seep from the very stones of the camp. Those who survived the journey found themselves facing a massive granite fortress, rising like a medieval castle from the Austrian hillside. Watchtowers loomed overhead, machine gun barrels tracking every new arrival. There was no mistaking this place's purpose. No one was meant to leave alive. SS Unterscharführer Johann Altfuldisch, chief of prisoner registration, stood behind a wooden table with ledger book and rubber stamp. His uniform was impeccably clean, boots polished to a mirror shine, a stark contrast to the filthy, emaciated figures being herded toward him. He had processed over 15,000 prisoners in 3 years, each following the same routine: strip naked, surrender all possessions, receive a number, cease to exist as a human being. Czech prisoners were forced to undress in front of hundreds of spectators, guards, capos, and other inmates who had learned that survival sometimes meant watching others suffer without showing emotion. Wedding rings were torn from fingers, family photographs ripped from trembling hands, prayer books thrown into burning piles. An elderly professor from Charles University tried to hide a locket containing his daughter's picture inside his shoe. A guard noticed the bulge, beat the man unconscious with a wooden club, and tossed the locket into the flames. Those still conscious were dragged to wooden tables where capos with electric clippers shaved their heads, eyebrows, and body hair. The hair fell in piles around their feet, later collected and shipped to factories manufacturing felt for the German war effort. Even in this degradation, the Nazis found ways to extract profit. Then came the numbers. Alt-Fuldisch stamped each prisoner's arm with black ink, leaving a serial number that would replace their name. Prisoner 27,364 had been Dr. Karol Svoboda, a surgeon who treated wounded partisans in Prague's underground hospitals. Prisoner 27,365 had been Anna Novakova, a schoolteacher who hid Jewish children in her basement. Their identities were erased as efficiently as if written in pencil and rubbed out. The uniforms, when provided at all, came from dead prisoners, striped cotton shirts and trousers not washed since their previous owners died wearing them. Many new arrivals received only rags, torn pieces of fabric, providing no protection against February's bitter cold. Their feet remained bare, expected to navigate sharp gravel pathways and frozen mud without shoes. Once processed, new prisoners were marched to Barracks 17, a wooden building designed for 300 people, but currently holding over 2,000. The moment they stepped inside, the full horror of Mauthausen revealed itself. The building reeked of unwashed bodies, human waste, and death. There were no beds, only wooden planks stacked in 3-tier bunks so narrow that prisoners slept on their sides, pressed against each other like corpses. Disease was rampant. Tuberculosis spread through the barracks like wildfire, leaving prisoners coughing blood onto filthy straw bedding. Typhus turned their skin yellow and filled their intestines with parasites, Dysentery left them unable to control their bowels, adding stench that permeated every corner. The latrines consisted of a single wooden board with holes cut into it, positioned over a pit that had not been emptied in months. 20 men at a time were forced to use this facility, with no privacy and no toilet paper. Those suffering from dysentery often soiled themselves where they stood. Guards found this entertaining, sometimes forcing sick prisoners to clean the floor with their bare hands while other inmates watched. At night, temperatures inside the barracks dropped well below freezing. Prisoners huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat in desperate attempts to prevent freezing to death. But even this basic survival instinct became a source of violent conflict. Stronger prisoners claimed spots in the middle, while weaker ones were pushed to the edges where the cold was most brutal. By morning, guards would drag out the stiffened bodies of those who had died during the night, corpses frozen solid. The psychological assault was as systematic as the physical torture. Guards addressed prisoners only by their stamped numbers, never by names. Any attempt to maintain human dignity was met with brutal punishment that served as a warning to all. The metal bowl clanged against the wooden table as prisoner 31,847 received his daily ration at 6 o'clock in the morning on March 15, 1943. Inside the dented aluminum container was a watery substance that the SS called soup, a thin, grey liquid made from potato peels, turnip scraps, and rotting vegetables salvaged from refuse piles. The bowl had never been washed, its interior coated with grease and previous meals that had turned rancid. This was breakfast, lunch, and dinner combined into a single serving that contained fewer calories than a German child consumed for breakfast alone. Heinrich Müller, a former mathematics professor from Vienna, stared at the liquid sloshing in his bowl. He had been at Mauthausen for 8 months, and his body had begun consuming itself for survival. His ribs protruded through his striped uniform, like broken umbrella framework. His cheekbones had become sharp ridges beneath skin that hung loose and yellow. At 53, he now weighed less than his teenage son had before the war. The daily ration in 1943 consisted of exactly 600 calories, barely enough to keep a sedentary adult alive, let alone men who spent 14 hours breaking rocks. By comparison, German soldiers received over 3,000 calories per day, while Reich civilians maintained rations of at least 1,800 calories. The deliberate mathematics of starvation were policy. Capo Wilhelm Frick, a German criminal prisoner who had murdered his wife in Hamburg, controlled food distribution in Barrack 12. His position granted him power over life and death through controlling soup portions. Those prisoners who showed him respect, who gave up part of their bread ration, might receive an extra ladle of watery broth. Those who crossed him received their bowl only half full, a death sentence delivered 1 spoonful at a time. Frick had gained 20 pounds since arriving at Mauthausen, his face round and healthy while surrounded by skeletal figures who competed for scraps like animals. He wore a red triangle marking him as a political prisoner, though his crimes had nothing to do with politics. The SS found criminals more reliable than intellectuals when it came to brutalizing fellow prisoners. The bread, when it arrived, was hard as stone and mixed with sawdust to extend supplies. A single slice had to last an entire day, and prisoners would divide it into tiny portions, chewing each morsel slowly to create the illusion of multiple meals. Some would save half their bread for evening, hiding it in their clothing despite the risk of theft. Others devoured it immediately, unable to resist the gnawing hunger that consumed their thoughts. Competition for food became vicious and desperate. Friendships that had sustained men through months of torture dissolved over a dropped crumb or an extra sip of soup. Jan Svoboda, the former Prague surgeon, found himself stealing bread from a dying man's jacket pocket, his medical oath shattered by necessity of survival. He wept as he ate the stolen bread, but ate it nonetheless. The SS encouraged this degradation by deliberately providing insufficient food for the number of prisoners. They understood that starving men would turn against each other rather than uniting against their captors. Hunger became their most effective weapon of control, more powerful than bullets or beatings. Some prisoners resorted to eating grass, tree bark, or leather strips torn from their shoes. Others dug through garbage piles, looking for potato skins or coffee grounds. The human body, pushed beyond its limits, began consuming muscle tissue and organs to maintain basic functions. The psychological effects were as devastating as the physical ones. Prisoners talked constantly about food, describing elaborate meals from their previous lives in obsessive detail. They dreamed of bread, of meat, of full bowls of soup. These fantasies became mental torture, making the reality of their empty stomachs unbearable. Muller watched as a French resistance fighter collapsed beside him, too weak to lift his soup bowl. The man's hands shook violently from malnutrition, spilling precious liquid onto the ground. Other prisoners immediately dropped to their knees, lapping up spilled soup from dirt with their tongues, their humanity reduced to the level of starving dogs fighting over scraps. This was the Nazi plan working exactly as intended, turning civilized human beings into desperate animals. The granite steps glistened with frost and blood at 5:30 in the morning on November 23, 1942, as the first work detail descended into the Mauthausen quarry. 186 steps, carved roughly into the Austrian rock face, stretched down into the pit like the entrance to hell itself. But these were not ordinary stairs. They were uneven, jagged, and deliberately treacherous, some rising 1/2 meter high, while others had been worn smooth by thousands of boots and bodies that had slipped and fallen to their deaths. Prisoner 28,491, formerly Professor Otto Neurer from Innsbruck University, felt the enormous granite block settle onto his shoulders as an SS guard shoved him toward the staircase. The stone weighed nearly 60 kilograms, more than half his current body weight after months of starvation. His knees buckled momentarily under the crushing load, but the rifle barrel pressed against his spine forced him forward. Behind him, dozens of other prisoners struggled under similar burdens, their skeletal frames barely able to support stones that would have challenged healthy men. The quarry work detail was Mauthausen's most feared assignment. While other prisoners manufactured airplane parts or built roads, those sent to extract granite faced a mathematical certainty of death. The SS guards called it productive labor, but everyone understood its true purpose to crush human beings as efficiently as they crushed stone. Neurer placed his right foot on the first step, feeling the rough granite bite through the thin sole of his wooden shoe. The stone on his back shifted, threatening to topple him backward into the prisoners climbing behind him. He gripped the rock with both hands, his fingers already numb from the November cold, and began the agonizing ascent that claimed dozens of lives every day. The stairs had earned their nickname through years of systematic murder disguised as industrial accident. SS Unterscharführer Georg Backmeyer stood at the top with a stopwatch, timing each prisoner's climb and recording failures in a leather logbook. Those who took longer than 4 minutes to reach the summit received 25 lashes with a metal-tipped whip. Those who collapsed were shot where they fell. Halfway up the staircase, Neurer's legs began to shake uncontrollably. The granite block had shifted position, pressing against his spine in a way that sent shooting pains through his lower back. His vision blurred as blood rushed from his head, and he could feel his grip on the stone beginning to loosen. Around him, other prisoners climbed in silence, their breathing ragged and desperate. The man directly behind Neurer, a young Czech resistance fighter named Pavel Novak, was carrying a stone nearly as large as himself. His face had turned grey with exertion, and foam had begun to form at the corners of his mouth. With 30 steps still remaining, Novak's left leg gave out completely. He fell backward, his granite block tumbling from his shoulders and striking the prisoner behind him in the chest. The domino effect began instantly. Novak's falling body crashed into the man below him, who lost his balance and toppled into the next prisoner down the line. Within seconds, a cascade of human bodies and 60-kilogram granite blocks came thundering down the stone staircase, like an avalanche of flesh and rock. The sound was horrific, the crack of breaking bones mixing with the crash of splitting stone and the screams of men being crushed under massive weights. 15 prisoners died in the collapse, their bodies mangled beyond recognition by the granite they had been carrying. Another dozen were severely injured, with broken ribs, shattered skulls, and crushed limbs that would never heal properly. The SS guards at the top of the staircase laughed and applauded, as if they had just witnessed an entertaining performance. But the stairs themselves were only the beginning of the horror. At the top of the staircase, on the edge of the quarry pit, stood a 50-meter cliff face that the SS had nicknamed the Parachutists' Wall. This sheer drop of jagged granite had become the site of one of Mauthausen's most sadistic execution methods. A twisted game that combined murder with psychological torture. Prisoners who were deemed too weak to work, those who had collapsed too many times during the stone-carrying ritual, or simply those who had irritated the guards, were led to the edge of the cliff. SS officers would then issue a simple command: jump. If the prisoner hesitated, they were beaten unconscious and thrown over the edge anyway. If they obeyed immediately, their death was slightly quicker. But sometimes the guards wanted entertainment. They would force one prisoner to push another off the cliff, creating an impossible choice between murdering an innocent man and being thrown off themselves. Many prisoners broke down completely when faced with this decision, collapsing to their knees and begging for mercy that would never come. The psychological devastation was as calculated as the physical destruction. Guards would often select prisoners who had formed friendships, forcing them to choose between their own survival and their companion's life. Those who refused to push were beaten and thrown off together, while those who complied had to live with the knowledge that they had killed someone they cared about. The sound of bodies hitting the granite rocks 50 meters below became a daily soundtrack at Mauthausen. By the end of 1942, over 3,000 prisoners had died on the stairs of death or at the Parachutists' Wall. The basement beneath Barrack 6 fell silent at 9:45 in the evening on January 12, 1944, as SS Unterscharführer Martin Roth turned the valve that released Zyklon B gas into the sealed chamber. Above him, 23 prisoners who had been told they were going to shower pressed their faces against the locked steel door, their screams already beginning to weaken as the hydrogen cyanide burned through their lungs. Unlike the massive gas chambers of Auschwitz-Birkenau, Mauthausen's killing facility was small, hidden, and designed for quiet elimination of prisoners who could no longer work. The chamber measured only 4 meters by 6 meters, with concrete walls painted white to maintain the illusion of a medical facility. Fake shower heads had been installed in the ceiling, and wooden benches lined the walls to accommodate prisoners who were told to sit while they waited for the water to warm up. The deception was so complete that many victims never realized what was happening until the gas began to take effect. Dr. Eduard Krebsbach, the camp's chief medical officer, stood outside the chamber with a stopwatch, timing the killing process with clinical precision. He had overseen over 400 gassing operations since the chamber became operational in 1942, documenting the effects of different concentrations of poison gas on human subjects. His reports to Berlin described the murders as medical research designed to improve efficiency in future operations. The prisoners chosen for the gas chamber were those deemed unfit for work men who had become too weak to carry granite blocks, those suffering from tuberculosis or dysentery, and anyone who had committed infractions against camp rules. But sometimes selections were made arbitrarily. Guards would simply point at prisoners during roll call, sending them to their deaths for no reason other than to maintain the chamber's regular operation schedule. 10 minutes after the gas was released, the screaming stopped. Krebsbach checked his watch and made a note in his leather logbook. The latest batch had taken longer to die than usual, possibly because the Zyklon B had been stored in cold temperatures. He made a recommendation for future operations to allow the gas canisters to warm to room temperature before use. But the gas chamber was not Mauthausen's only method of systematic execution. In the courtyard behind the administration building, a brick wall had been constructed specifically for firing squad executions. Every Tuesday and Friday at dawn, groups of prisoners were marched out in chains and lined up against the wall with their backs to the executioners. SS guards with rifles would take positions 20 meters away and fire on command, the sound of gunshots echoing across the camp. The executions followed a brutal routine designed to maximize terror. Prisoners were not told they were going to die until they reached the courtyard. They were given no opportunity to say goodbye to friends or write final letters to family members. The guards would simply order them to face the wall, and within minutes they were dead, their bodies falling into trenches that had been dug the previous evening by other prisoners who did not yet know they would be next. Some executions were even more sadistic. During the winter months, when temperatures dropped below freezing, guards would force prisoners into large wooden barrels filled with ice water. The victims were held underwater until they stopped struggling, their bodies turning blue as hypothermia and drowning combined to cause death. SS officers called this hydrotherapy and laughed as they watched men freeze to death in agony. The camp's infirmary became another site of systematic murder. SS doctors conducted medical experiments on living prisoners, injecting them with deadly diseases to study the progression of illness. Others had organs removed without anesthesia, or were subjected to surgical procedures designed to cause maximum pain rather than any medical benefit. Dr. Krebsbach personally oversaw experiments involving malaria, typhus, and tuberculosis, infecting healthy prisoners and documenting their deaths with scientific detachment. Hanging was reserved for prisoners who had attempted to escape or who had been caught stealing food. But unlike traditional executions where victims died quickly from broken necks, Mauthausen's hangings were designed to cause slow strangulation. Prisoners were suspended from iron beams with short ropes, their feet barely touching the ground as they slowly suffocated over periods of 10 to 15 minutes. Other inmates were forced to watch as warnings about the consequences of resistance. The crematorium ovens ran constantly, burning the bodies of those killed in the gas chamber, shot at the execution wall, drowned in ice water barrels, or murdered during medical experiments. Thick black smoke poured from the chimneys day and night, carrying the smell of burning human flesh across the surrounding Austrian countryside. Local residents complained about the odour, but authorities dismissed their concerns as necessary industrial processes. By early 1945, over 20,000 prisoners had been systematically murdered at Mauthausen through these various execution methods. The camp had become a factory of death that operated with German industrial efficiency, producing corpses instead of consumer goods while maintaining meticulous records of every murder committed within its walls. The camera lens clicked softly in the darkness of the photography laboratory at 11:23 in the evening on September 8, 1943, as Spanish prisoner Antonio Garcia Barrios carefully developed the latest roll of film he had smuggled out of the crematorium. His hands shook as he watched the images emerge in the chemical bath photographs that would later become some of the most important evidence of Nazi war crimes ever preserved. Garcia and his fellow Spanish political prisoners had been risking their lives for months to document the horrors of Mauthausen. The Spanish prisoners had arrived at Mauthausen in August 1942, survivors of the Spanish Civil War who had fled to France only to be captured when the Germans occupied the country. These men, former soldiers, journalists, and intellectuals, found themselves uniquely positioned within the camp's hierarchy. Their technical skills landed them work assignments in the photography laboratory and administration offices. where they had access to cameras and developing equipment. Garcia, a former newspaper photographer from Madrid, realized that the Nazis were systematically destroying evidence of their crimes. Documents were burned regularly, and orders had come from Berlin to eliminate all photographic records of executions, medical experiments, and conditions inside the barracks. But the Spanish prisoners understood something their captors did not. They knew that someday the world would demand proof. Working in shifts during night hours, when guards were less vigilant, the Spanish prisoners began their dangerous mission. José Cereceda, a former Republican Army officer, would steal film from laboratory supplies, while Garcia operated the camera and Francisco Boix handled developing. They photographed everything they could access: prisoners carrying stones up the stairs of death, bodies piled in the crematorium, medical experiments in progress, and daily roll calls where selections were made for execution. The greatest challenge was not taking the photographs, but preserving them. The prisoners knew that hiding negatives inside the camp would eventually lead to discovery and death. They needed someone outside the barbed wire who could be trusted with evidence of genocide. That person turned out to be Anna Pointner, a young Austrian woman who worked as a secretary in the nearby town. Pointner had observed the daily arrival of prisoner transports and the constant smoke rising from the camp's chimneys. She had also noticed the smell of burning flesh that periodically drifted over the town, despite German officials' claims that the facility was simply a labor camp. When Garcia approached her through Austrian resistance contacts, she agreed to help without hesitation. The transfer of film required elaborate planning and perfect timing. Spanish prisoners assigned to work details outside the camp would hide small rolls of developed negatives in their clothing or inside tools. During brief moments when guards were distracted, they would pass the film to Pointner, who would then bury it in her garden. Over 18 months, she received and hid hundreds of photographs documenting systematic murder. The risks were enormous for everyone involved. If German authorities had discovered the photography operation, the Spanish prisoners would have been executed, and Pointner and her family would have faced the same fate. The Nazis had made it clear that any civilian caught assisting prisoners would be treated as a traitor. Despite the constant danger, the Spanish prisoners continued their work until the final days of the war. They understood that they were creating a historical record that would survive even if they did not. Their photographs would speak for the thousands who had died when the perpetrators inevitably denied their crimes. By April 1945, over 800 photographs had been safely buried in Pointner's garden, waiting to be unearthed as evidence of the Nazi nightmare that had consumed Mauthausen. The air inside Barrack 12 reeked of death and human waste at 4:30 in the morning on February 7, 1945, as prisoner 33,892 tried to distinguish between the living and the dead among the bodies piled around him. Heinrich Müller, the former mathematics professor from Vienna, had survived nearly 2 years at Mauthausen, but he could feel his strength finally abandoning him. His body weight had dropped to less than 40 kilograms, and his skin had taken on the translucent yellow color that marked prisoners in their final stages of starvation. The winter of 1944 to 1945 had been the most brutal in Mauthausen's history. Food rations had been cut to fewer than 300 calories per day as German supply lines collapsed under Allied bombing campaigns. Prisoners were dying at a rate of over 100 per day, their bodies stacked like cordwood in the camp's overcrowded morgue. The crematorium ovens, running continuously since 1943, could no longer keep pace with the mounting death toll. But it was not just hunger that was killing the remaining prisoners. It was the complete breakdown of the camp's infrastructure. Water supplies had been contaminated for months, spreading typhus and dysentery throughout the barracks. Medical supplies had disappeared entirely, leaving sick prisoners to die without any form of treatment. Even the basic pretense of running a labor camp had been abandoned as guards focused their remaining energy on destroying evidence of their crimes. SS Oberfuhrer Franz Zieres, the camp commandant who had overseen the construction and expansion of the Mauthausen complex, spent his final months at the camp burning documents and executing witnesses. On January 15, 1945, he had ordered the shooting of all prisoners who worked in the administration offices, fearing they possessed too much knowledge about the camp's operations. 2 weeks later, he commanded the destruction of all medical records documenting the experimental procedures conducted on inmates. The remaining SS guards had become increasingly erratic and violent as news of German military defeats reached the camp. Some had begun drinking heavily, leading to random acts of brutality against prisoners who happened to cross their paths. Others had started hoarding supplies and making plans to flee before Allied forces arrived. The careful organization that had characterized Mauthausen's operation for over 6 years was disintegrating into chaos and panic. Müller watched as guards dragged another group of corpses from the barracks, adding them to the growing pile of bodies in the camp's central courtyard. The dead were no longer being processed through the crematorium. There was simply no fuel left to operate the ovens. Instead, the bodies were being stacked in massive pyres and burned in the open air, sending columns of black smoke into the Austrian sky that could be seen for kilometers. Some prisoners had begun hiding among the corpses during daylight hours, knowing that the guards no longer bothered to check whether bodies in the morgue were actually dead. It was a desperate survival strategy that sometimes worked guards would grab what appeared to be a corpse and throw it onto the burning pile without realizing they were murdering someone who was still alive. Francisco Boix, one of the Spanish prisoners who had been secretly photographing conditions at Mauthausen, managed to hide his camera equipment as guards began searching barracks for contraband. He knew that documenting these final weeks would be crucial evidence for any future prosecution of war criminals. The images he captured showed prisoners reduced to walking skeletons, bodies piled in courtyards like garbage, and SS guards systematically destroying records. On March 1, 1945, Zieres received orders from Berlin to begin liquidating the camp entirely. The plan called for the execution of all remaining prisoners and the destruction of all physical evidence that Mauthausen had ever existed. But by this point, many SS personnel had already fled, leaving insufficient manpower to carry out such a massive operation. The few guards who remained focused on saving themselves rather than following orders. They abandoned their posts, changed into civilian clothing, and disappeared into the Austrian countryside, hoping to avoid capture when Allied forces arrived. Some tried to destroy the camp's records by setting fire to administration buildings, but most of the documents had already been moved or hidden. By April 1, 1945, Mauthausen had effectively ceased to function as a concentration camp. It had become something even worse, a place where thousands of human beings were simply abandoned to die in the most horrific conditions imaginable. The sound of tank engines rumbled across the Austrian countryside at 10 o'clock in the morning on May 5, 1945, as the 1st Sherman tank of the United States 11th Armored Division crested the hill overlooking Mauthausen concentration camp. Staff Sergeant Albert Koziek, the tank commander, raised his binoculars and stared in disbelief at the scene below. Through the morning mist, he could see thousands of skeletal figures stumbling around what appeared to be a medieval fortress surrounded by barbed wire. The stench of death and human waste was so overwhelming that it reached the American soldiers even at a distance of several hundred meters. Captain Richard Seibel, commanding the lead reconnaissance unit, had received intelligence reports about German prison camps, but nothing had prepared him for what lay ahead. As his convoy approached the main gate, prisoners began emerging from wooden barracks, some crawling on their hands and knees because they lacked the strength to walk. Others simply stood motionless, staring at the American uniforms as if they were seeing ghosts. Many appeared to be more dead than alive, their eyes sunken deep into skulls covered by skin so thin it was nearly transparent. The few remaining SS guards had abandoned their posts during the night, fleeing into the surrounding forests in civilian clothing. Only a handful of Austrian guards remained, and they surrendered without resistance when faced with American tanks and infantry. The camp's administration had effectively collapsed weeks earlier, leaving the prisoners to survive or die without any supervision, food, or medical care. As American soldiers entered the camp, they discovered scenes that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In Barrack 6, they found over 200 corpses stacked like firewood, some so recently dead that their bodies were still warm. In the camp's infirmary, they discovered prisoners who had been left to die on wooden tables after failed medical experiments, their bodies bearing surgical scars and injection marks from Nazi doctors who had used them as human laboratory animals. The crematorium compound revealed the full scope of the atrocities committed at Mauthausen. American soldiers found rooms filled with hundreds of pairs of shoes, piles of clothing, and boxes containing gold teeth extracted from murder victims. The ovens themselves were still warm, containing partially burned human remains that SS guards had been unable to destroy before fleeing. Outside the building, massive piles of ashes mixed with bone fragments covered the ground like grey snow. But it was the granite quarry that provided the most shocking evidence of systematic murder. The famous stairs of death carved into the rock face were stained with blood and littered with granite blocks that prisoners had been carrying when they collapsed and died. At the bottom of the 50-meter cliff, known as the Parachutists' Wall, American soldiers discovered hundreds of skeletons, the remains of prisoners who had been forced to jump to their deaths. Sergeant Koziek later wrote in his diary that the worst moment came when prisoners began trying to kiss the hands and boots of American soldiers, weeping and speaking in languages he could not understand, but whose meaning was unmistakable: gratitude for being saved from hell on earth. Many of the liberated prisoners were so weak they collapsed from the excitement of seeing their liberators, their hearts unable to handle the sudden surge of hope after years of hopelessness. Among the survivors, American forces found several Spanish political prisoners who had been secretly documenting conditions at the camp. Francisco Boix approached Captain Seibel with a hidden cache of photographic negatives that he had managed to preserve throughout the war. These images, he explained through an interpreter, were proof of the systematic murder that had taken place at Mauthausen. The photographs showed executions, medical experiments, prisoners carrying stones up the stairs of death, and the daily routine of industrial-scale killing. One of the most moving moments of the liberation came when a group of Spanish prisoners climbed to the top of the main gate and hung a massive banner reading, "The Spanish anti-fascists salute the forces of liberation." These men, who had fought against fascism in their own country before being captured and sent to Mauthausen, had survived to see the defeat of the Nazi regime that had imprisoned and tortured them. American medics immediately began providing emergency medical care to survivors, but for many prisoners, the liberation had come too late. Their bodies, weakened by years of starvation and abuse, could not recover from the damage that had been inflicted upon them. Over 300 liberated prisoners died in the first week after the camp was freed, their systems too damaged to accept food and medical treatment. The American soldiers also discovered hidden archives that would prove crucial for future war crimes prosecutions. While SS guards had destroyed many documents before fleeing, they had been unable to eliminate all evidence of their crimes. Buried records revealed the names of guards who had committed murders, detailed accounts of medical experiments, and transportation records showing how many prisoners had been sent to Mauthausen from across occupied Europe. As news of the liberation spread, Austrian civilians from surrounding towns were forced to visit the camp and witness what had been taking place in their midst. The liberation of Mauthausen marked the end of 7 years of systematic torture and murder, but it also marked the beginning of the world's reckoning with the full scope of Nazi crimes against humanity. The photographs emerged from Anna Pointner's garden, like ghosts rising from the Austrian soil on May 10, 1945, as American investigators carefully unearthed the metal containers that had been buried for over 18 months. Captain James Morrison of the U.S. Army War Crimes Investigation Unit held the first roll of developed film up to the sunlight, squinting at images that would soon become some of the most important evidence in the prosecution of Nazi war criminals. The negatives had survived the war intact. Francisco Boyce stood beside the American officers as they examined each photograph, providing testimony about when and where each image had been taken. The pictures revealed the systematic nature of the murders committed at Mauthausen with devastating clarity. Here were prisoners carrying granite blocks up the stairs of death, their faces twisted in agony. There were images of bodies piled in the crematorium, evidence of medical experiments conducted on living human beings, and documentation of the daily selections that sent thousands to their deaths. When the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal convened 6 months later, these photographs became crucial evidence in establishing the guilt of Nazi officials who claimed they had known nothing about concentration camp conditions. The images spoke for the dead, providing irrefutable proof that the Holocaust was not merely individual cruelty, but a systematic program of genocide planned and executed by the German state. Dr. Eduard Krebsbach, the former chief medical officer at Mauthausen, who had overseen hundreds of gassing operations and medical experiments, was arrested in Munich in July 1945. When confronted with photographic evidence of his crimes, he initially denied any wrongdoing, claiming he had merely been following orders. But the Spanish prisoner's photographs showed him personally supervising executions and selecting victims for experimental procedures. He was convicted of crimes against humanity and sentenced to death. Franz Ziereis, the camp commandant, was captured by American forces while attempting to flee to Switzerland. Shot while resisting arrest, he lived long enough to provide a detailed confession about Mauthausen's operations before dying from his wounds. His testimony, combined with the photographic evidence, revealed the full scope of the killing machine he had commanded. But the most profound impact of the hidden photographs was not in the courtroom, it was in ensuring that the world could never deny what had happened at Mauthausen. As Allied forces liberated concentration camps across Germany and Austria, Nazi officials immediately began claiming that reports of systematic murder were exaggerated propaganda. The Spanish prisoners' carefully preserved documentation made such denials impossible. The images were published in newspapers across America and Europe, forcing the world to confront the reality of Nazi genocide. People who had dismissed earlier reports as wartime propaganda could no longer ignore evidence when confronted with photographs showing piles of corpses, starving prisoners, and the industrial machinery of death that had operated in civilized Europe. Anna Pointner, the Austrian woman who had risked her life to hide the evidence, was honored by the American military government. She had understood, even in the darkest days of the war, that someday the world would demand proof of what had occurred in her hometown. The liberation of Mauthausen and the revelation of the photographic evidence marked a turning point in human understanding of the capacity for evil that could exist within seemingly civilized societies. The camp had been built not by monsters from another world, but by ordinary people who had chosen to participate in systematic murder. The granite stones that prisoners had carried up those deadly stairs became monuments to human cruelty, but also to the resilience of those who survived. Today, the preserved photographs from Mauthausen serve as an eternal warning about the dangers of unchecked hatred and the importance of bearing witness to atrocity. They remind us that silence in the face of evil is complicity, and that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would reduce human beings to numbers and ash.